I was researching what ended up being the same thing that I was researching then later for my PhD, and what I'm still looking at is in French, and I was looking at different dialects of French. There are differences in what we call vowel nasality, and they are what we call contrastive. So whether there's air coming out of your nose or not can completely change the meaning of a word. So there's a difference between like peau, which is skin, and pont, which is bridge, right? So to a French person, they have no idea what they're doing, right? But what's really going on is that for pont, there's air coming out of the nose, but it also affects the acoustic signal in a way that we don't really understand what's going on in the vocal tract other than air coming out of the nose. So what I looked at is studying the vocal tract along with the air coming out of the nose to see what is truly happening in the inside the head of a French speaker when they're producing these different sounds.
Right. Okay. And why is there? That's a very subtle difference. That must be really difficult. Like for me, like I could barely hear it, but just one felt more nasally.
Yep.
Why is that? Is that important? Did one evolve from the other? Can you tell us a bit more
Yeah,
about it?
so there are a lot of different languages that have phonemic vowel nasality, like French or Hindi or Portuguese, and they produce the nasal vowels in different ways, but a common evolution of vowel nasality is from when a nasal consonant is next to a vowel and you pronounce it very quickly in regular speech. The timing of the lowering of the velum, which allows air to come out of the nose, is not always precise because we're not robots. You know, it takes us time to do things, and it can sort of bleed over in a way into the vowel itself. So what you get is an overlap of an oral vowel where there is no nasalization, and a nasal consonant like or where there is nasalization, and then the overlap creates a nasal vowel or vowel nasality on it. And the more that happens, the more speakers of a language throughout generations can start to contribute that to the vowel itself and start to produce it that way. So actually, English is undergoing a very similar sound change in a lot of dialects. You get in my dialect, in Pacific Northwest American English, you get a difference between cat, C-A-T, and can't, C-A-N, apostrophe T, but you don't pronounce the N, right? Cat, can't,
So all I hear is cat and can't.
right?
But are you saying that you guys, those are synonymous in America?
They're not synonymous, they're different words, but where you pronounce a little bit of an N, in my dialect, it has evolved far enough that the N is no longer pronounced, and the only difference between those is cat has, so there are two consonants, the k, and then at the end the t, and in the middle the vowel a, and in can't, same k and t, but in the middle you have an. That's it. There is no N. There is an oral vowel in cat and a nasal vowel in can't, and that's what makes the difference between the two words.
And so going back to what you were saying before, so it's actually the consonants that change the vowel to become nasal.
Yes.
And then slowly and slowly that vowel becomes nasal and people just pronounce it as a nasal vowel.
Yes, yeah. And when you get to the point in the evolution of that sound change where the speaker starts to cognitively contribute the nasalization to the vowel and no longer to the consonant, there's no need for the consonant anymore and it's not pronounced.
Why does language evolve that way?
That is a big question. We don't really have an answer to that. What we don't have an answer to is why language evolves, period. Right? It's just something that always happens. So if you take a snapshot of English right now, you're understanding me, I'm understanding you. Why don't we just stick with that, right? It works, so why does the system have to change? Hopefully someday we'll have an answer to that. We don't yet. But what we do understand are individual sort of little reasons why certain sound changes may occur. And then the more that we can understand and put together those individual sound changes, we can get a better picture of why, as a cognitive process, do humans change in this way.
Right. To me, as a biochemist and cell biologist, language evolving almost seems like how we as human beings evolve. So you have these small mutations in your DNA, and eventually over time those build up, and next thing you know, over like generations, thousands of generations, you have a complete new species. In this case, it would be a completely new language.
Yep.
In our body, we have a lot of errors. So the human, even in our genome, there's a lot of nonsense in there. There's a lot of repetition. You can see there's all these errors, and that's what supports the idea of evolution. Is it the same thing with languages?
Yes, but we view them less as errors and more as variation. That's actually, it's crucial to our understanding of language. So if we were not able to deal with variability, we wouldn't, for example, as children grow up, they wouldn't be able to understand speakers who are not, for example, their parents, right? So anyone they meet out on the street, if they go to the market, that person does not have the same voice as their mom or their dad. If they can't deal with that kind of variation, they're not going to be able to understand them. So in both the cognitive process and the perception of language, and then also in how we produce language, variation is crucial to that whole cycle. And that variation introduces mutations, as you would call them in your field of study.
Right.
And if those mutations then start to then be perceived as something significant, then you have sound change.
Right, okay. And those that aren't perceived to be significant are just ignored.
Exactly.
That's interesting. What I was trying to get to with the previous question also is, one of the reasons why we don't know, we do know there isn't an intelligent design when it comes to species and human beings is because of all these other mutations that aren't, as you said, aren't significant, so aren't noticed in our biology. And you can look at the evolution of species and you can see that this isn't the best way of doing it, but through evolution, we've come to this point and it works well enough to survive. When you look at language, is there a similarity in the sense that, do we have man-made languages that are, like, what would be the difference? I'm thinking, I don't know, I have this thought that if there was a man-made language, it'd be much more efficient. You wouldn't have consonants and sounds and phonemes that aren't really necessary for communication because of trial and error that might arise from normal language development. Would that be fair to say?
Not quite sure about that. I mean, we do have man-made languages like
Dothraki in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and Elvish and Klingon and even Esperanto as not. So the idea behind Esperanto is that it's not a fictional language. It's a language that people have created to actually use to communicate. But these languages don't seem to work in the same way that natural human languages do. And the ways that they do work are often borrowed from real human languages. So we're very good as a species at pattern recognition and taking signals and processing them and sifting out what's important and what's not. And when we apply that to language, we come up with something that internally our cognitive process can do that we can't do explicitly quite yet, not as well. Right. So we're just really good at creating systems like that.
Thanks for listening to Blab Codes. Rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, because it does help us spread the word. And if you like what we're doing here, then help us grow it by sharing this with a friend of a friend, or your mailman, even your mailman's mailman. We also want to hear from you, so send us questions or comments to blabquotes@gmail.com. And if you have any interesting questions or comments, then we'll talk about it on air.